I was lucky in that when I first came into the theatre, the, as it were, legend of the director as God was very slowly but definitely dying. But I would say the best directors have been actors. And that's certainly true of Greg Doran, who's artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, about to relinquish his post, and certainly true of Ben Caron, who directed me in The Crown. They understand an actor's needs. A director we need because he can see, or she can see, the overall picture. An actor in the early days of rehearsal will have a very good idea of the shape of his or her role, the size of the horse he or she is riding, but not how that fits in with all the other energies in the play. The thing about designers is that their work has often started before you've done the first day of rehearsal. And with Catherine of Aragon particularly, I was so lucky because when we got to what is actually Catherine's last scene, her death scene, I said, why, when she's sent off in banishment virtually to the wild west of England, are we still having her wearing this Tudor costume, which is very sharply defined and very structured, when we know that she's going to die? Can we ditch the costume and just give me something like a shroud? And bless them, they said, okay. Now, that isn't often possible, that a designer will be that accommodating. And this is how amenable the Royal Shakespeare Company are.
Though we have focused this course on how actors take Shakespeare's words on the page and bring them to life on the stage, doing this successfully involves many more people than just the people you see. Behind the scenes, there are producers, directors, designers, stage managers, prop managers, set builders, painters, and many other craftspeople, all pouring their expertise into each production. In this lesson, we'll explore some of their important contributions, and we'll give special attention to the costume designer as we go backstage for a tour of the shop. Producing any play for an audience is an intense and time-consuming experience for everyone involved. At the professional level, it usually involves months of pre-production planning, including directorial research, design meetings, building set elements, hanging theatrical lights, and hiring staff and actors. As we saw in the previous lessons, the next phase is 4 to 6 weeks of intensive actor rehearsal. The final phase is called Tech Week, when the lights, sound, and costumes are added into the rehearsal process. And this phase can actually last more than 1 week, depending on the budget and technical requirements of the production. Only after all this work is complete can a play finally open. When preparing to produce a Shakespeare play today, there are many additional elements to consider. First and foremost, we need time to consider the time and place in which the plays were written. When Shakespeare was writing, playhouses were the main source of entertainment. There were, of course, no televisions, radios, or movies in 16th century England. Printing presses were still relatively new inventions, and the ability to share stories or other information across large groups of people was still pretty limited. So in many ways, the Elizabethan playhouse was the main public gathering place for exchanging ideas. In fact, playhouses were considered so powerful that they were routinely shut down in times of political unrest. So producers, directors, and all the other artists preparing to bring a Shakespeare play to the stage today must take into consideration the fact that they're doing so in a different setting, a modern theater filled with modern audiences. So we think about our theater's geographical location, our audience demographics, and the traditions that influence and guide that particular setting. We ask ourselves, who will watch this performance? What experiences, perspectives, and biases might this audience bring into the theater with them? How are those different than the perspectives that Elizabethan audiences might have brought into their playhouses? And perhaps most importantly, we ask ourselves, why are we performing this particular play for this particular group of people? And what do we hope to give the audience? Asking these questions helps artists decide what theme, message, or visual style they might want to highlight in performance. As I mentioned at the beginning of this course, a play script is not a finished product, but a template for action. It's a starting place for an onstage experience. The many people involved in the production of a Shakespeare play can find all sorts of different ways to present a play while still staying true to the playwright's intention. When I begin research to direct a Shakespeare play, I take many factors into account, including the time and place in which Shakespeare was writing, and also the history of productions of that particular play, meaning any significant productions of the play from Elizabethan times to the present day that might inform not only my own perceptions about the play, but also the audience's expectations. As the director, it's also important for me to get to know the structure of the play as thoroughly as possible. I analyze each character and their function in the story, the setting and timeline of the play's action, and the arc of the plot. I also note the specific words that are used most often, because a playwright's repetition of certain words is usually intentional and might be significant, especially if the playwright is William Shakespeare. They might provide clues in terms of the production's tone, mood, or even visual elements. Essentially, because the director's vision is meant to unify all elements of the production, from design elements to acting choices, it's important for me to get to know the play better than anyone else, except maybe the playwright. In today's theaters, directors also collaborate with costume, scene, sound, and lighting designers, which are all considered invaluable in helping shape the audience's experience of a play. However, it's interesting to note that when Shakespeare was producing his plays, there were no directors or designers, at least not in the modern sense. Actors were largely in charge of their own performances and were expected to be able to sing, dance, and stage their own sword fights. They were also expected to memorize their parts very quickly. Since the Globe Theatre alone was known to produce up to 11 different plays every 2 weeks. Elizabethan companies also performed their plays in rep, which meant that the same play was never performed 2 days in a row. And a company of actors, such as Shakespeare's own company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, might have had 20 to 40 plays in their repertoire at any given time, covering the gamut of comedies, tragedies, and histories. This number of plays and words would be unheard of for a modern acting company. Knowing that these companies produced plays so prolifically leads us to suppose that their performances might have been a bit more spontaneous and loose than most professional actors' performances are today. Actors might have performed one play in the afternoon after rehearsing another all morning. They were expected to have their lines at least loosely memorized, though written reports indicate that there may have been some paraphrasing and cueing from backstage, giving an improvisatory feel to each performance. To understand how quick on their feet these performers must have been, just imagine improvising in iambic pentameter. To further complicate actor preparation, the actors were also not given full copies of the scripts they were rehearsing and performing. Because mass printing was not easily available, actors were given a long parchment for each play called their rôle, with only their own lines on them, and maybe the cue line that meant it was their turn to talk. So they had to listen closely in rehearsal and in performance to make sure they knew when to enter and when to speak. The heightened speed at which plays were staged might be one reason for the pared-down design elements used in productions at that time. In the 16th century, playhouses like the Globe had a balcony at the back of the stage and trapdoors in the floor from which actors could emerge or disappear. But because there were few ways to mechanize or speed up big scenic changes, and since Shakespeare plays flow very quickly from one locale to another, the stage elements were kept to a minimum. This required the actors to compensate, using the imagery and the language to supply the theatrical spectacle for the audience's imaginations. If the dialogue mentioned a forest, the audience was expected to imagine it. If the dialogue mentioned a candle lighting a dark room, the audience had to imagine a dimly lit room, in spite of the brightly lit, open-air stage and audience. 16th century actors also had one pair of what they called acting clothes, appropriate to the types of characters they usually played. Though they might have added and subtracted pieces from that basic outfit as needed during a performance, most written accounts of productions from that time period do not reference elaborate costumes or costume changes. In large part, acting was still considered a lower-class activity, and some accounts of productions from the Elizabethan era note that actors bought or received donations of extra clothing from lords and ladies who were theatrical patrons in order to convincingly play royal and high-class characters. Things are quite different from modern productions of Shakespeare. Once the play has been cast, the costume designer takes measurements of each actor and begins to create costumes that will suit the time period and aesthetic of the world being created on stage in a given production, all in the effort to visually bring the characters to life. I had the opportunity to go into the costume shop in the Helmrich School of Drama at the University of Oklahoma and meet with costume designer Lloyd Kell. I talked with him about how his design process works when he's creating period costumes for productions of Shakespeare and other plays set in the Elizabethan era.
Lloyd, I'm so excited to talk to you a little bit about some of your designs and about your experience designing both for Shakespeare and for other productions that are set in Elizabethan periods.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we have here some of your costumes for our production, actually, of Mary, Queen of Scots.
Right.
And this was written by Frederick Schiller, not during the Elizabethan time, but it's certainly set in the Elizabethan period. And these are some of my favorites of your costume designs. Will you talk a little bit about these costume designs and about the special challenges and opportunities of designing for this kind of production?
The first thing you want to do really is to understand what the period is. What were the people like in this period? Obviously, you're going to read the script first because that's the guiding light. But as a designer, I have to truly understand what these people looked like. In this particular script, it did talk about people that lived, that were real people.
Right.
Even though the situation wasn't real, the actual people they talked about existed. So the first thing you're going to do is to start looking at portraiture. Who was Elizabeth? What did Elizabeth look like? What did Mary Stuart look like? And the various men that manipulated them. So the first thing I did was sort of look at all of these different portraits, look at the way they stand and look at the shape. And then the next thing is to go into depth and look at really detailed illustrations of understructures, of clothing, and how they really change the physicality of that performer. We're going to be putting people in understructures that restrict the body. We're going to be putting people in corsets. We're going to be putting people in farthingales, padded bum rolls, all things that are really make movement really difficult.
Yeah, and for the women, particularly if they're corseted, right, it also means they can't bend at the waist. It affects their breath. And actually for actors, it affects their vocal production as well.
Very much so. So that's one of the reasons why, as a designer, you like to get your performer into some sort of rehearsal garment really early. Corset, bum roll, farthingale, petticoat, shoes, whatever it might be, because it does affect everything.
Yeah.
It affects the way you sit, it affects the way you move, it affects the way you present yourself. And it should do, because we're reflecting a time period.
So you're thinking about the history, the historical way that they would have dressed, the structures and the fabrics probably that these costumes would have been made out of. But then you're also thinking about the actor and the production and the theater in which it's being performed, and probably then taking some creative liberties in terms of what actually appears on the stage.
You do have to. In some ways, you've got to bring your audience in. The last thing you want to do is alienate your audience. The audience has a perception, and sometimes that perception might not really be accurate. There are things that happened and the way that people wore costumes that today's audience would look at it and laugh and go, that can't possibly be true.
So you want to split the difference in a way that makes them understand what time period you're representing, but not necessarily be so accurate that they are distanced.
Well, we're not doing a reenactment.
Yeah, great.
We're doing a theatrical version of, which we often try to get as close as possible. But you're also taking into account the script. You're taking into account there may be a character arc that can only be shown by choice of colour. So one of the interesting things about this particular, or any production, is the collaboration between the director, the designer, and the performer. And it's really important. It's one of those few truly collaborative art forms that can take many different directions.
Absolutely. And I find as a director that the costume designer can really impact what happens on the stage. And if we're communicating well with each other, as you and I were able to do on this production, the elements come together in a way that I think is pretty exciting to watch.
And I think for us, especially discussing how these characters moved and how their arc changed and how you had the all-powerful Elizabeth at the beginning of the play become the one that actually loses her power, and at the end of Mary's life she suddenly becomes the powerful one. She had taken her life into her own hands as such and forced the issue that eventually led to her demise.
What I loved is that you were able to really track that arc for both of the characters through color and texture and change of shape even as they went along. And some of these things that you and I talked about, the audience will catch.
Yes.
And some of them they won't catch consciously, but they will be there just to support the work.
And with Mary Stuart, I found this illustration of her in black, and she'd got gold on it, and it reminded me of a cage. So I then designed our version, which is here, which is really similar to that. But I decided I want to make it more stark. I wanted the sort of cage effect to be more obvious.
And the audience might not know exactly what we're doing there, but the way she moves, the way she is constricted will still do its work on the audience.
The funny thing is with that is both of them really are caged. Both of them are restricted. Both of them are women in a man's world.
Yeah.
And both of them are restricted by the limitations that other people put on them. And that's one of the things we wanted to show, even though the costumes are flamboyant, even though the costumes are massive, and there's a big footprint. But to produce that footprint, there is all of this understructure underneath, which restricts the movement of the body.
Which the actors also have to learn to carry and wear so that they can breathe, so that they can talk, so that they can express themselves.
It's really important for a designer to actually get, even if it's not the actual costume, but a facsimile of the costume with the corsets, the shoes, wigs, pantycoats, whatever else it might be, onto the performer as early as possible, both men and women, because men were also dressed differently. We're focusing on the women because the story is about them, but also it's surrounded by men that are manipulating them.
You are also wonderful about checking in with actors and directors about what physical blocking, physical movement is required in a production so that you can build around those needs.
Yeah, it's very important to me to go to rehearsal. It's very important to me when the actual actor comes in and actually starts trying on, if a costume is being built for them, if they're going to come in, they're going to try on the first mock-up. I want them to do some movement. I want them to have the shoes. I want them to have all the accessories. That way they can build their own confidence. And that way, with them talking to the director and I and the performer talking, I can find out what attributes, how do I help this performer tell a story. The interesting thing with costume, especially in Shakespeare, because quite often the Shakespearean language, as we have studied and we know how beautiful it is, quite often with the audience, they don't get it all. So in some ways, the costume actually has to help the performer tell the story or become the character.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the things as a designer, you have to look at the script. And if there's anything in the script that actually gives you a clue about this particular character, as with 12th Night Malvolio's yellow cross-gartered stockings, which to us is extreme. But then you have to think about when it was written, what did yellow mean back then? Why did the marvellous author Shakespeare, why did he pick that particular colour for that character?
I'm remembering that in Mary Stuart, we threw you an extra curveball by making it actually rain on stage. So then not only did you have the structures and the history to think about in terms of costumes, but you had to make sure we wouldn't melt the costumes when it physically rained on the actors.
Which was a brilliant challenge and great fun. And I think the end result was pretty spectacular. And I think that was a combination of scenic lighting, directing, performance. Everybody bought into it. And I think for me, it was a really, really special moment. The discovery for us actually was how to actually, make Mary look pretty splendid before she was rained on. And then for the costume to be usable the next time without building too costume.
Right.
And we came across a 50s petticoat, bridal petticoat, believe it or not, and we realised that it poofed back up overnight. So we were very lucky where that was concerned. And it was great fun.
It really
All
was.
the different sort of experiments and challenges before we got that right.
Yes, we did. It all involves a lot of trial and error, right? This is what I love about the creative process and collaboration.
And that's one of the things I think is remarkable about the collaboration of the theatre with the director and with the performer and with all of the elements. And then eventually the audience.
Yeah.
Because without an audience, what are we doing?
As Lloyd explained, his work on any show begins well before the start of rehearsals and involves a lot of time behind the scenes. One important part of that process is the costume fitting, when the actors try on costume pieces. I was recently able to observe Lloyd doing a costume fitting with Cam.
Hi, Cam. My name's Lloyd Cratner. I'm a professor of costume design. Nice to meet you. I see you've got your trousers, boots, and shirt on already for your character, who is
Duke Orsino on the 12th night.
Fantastic, great fun. So at the moment, looking at yourself in the mirror, seeing that it's a really good slim fit, which is period appropriate. Okay. Is there anything that in your movement that's coming up that you think would restrict you in any way?
No, I feel really comfortable, very comfortable. I can make all the gestures generally probably would make. Feels good.
Great. So have you walked around in the boots to make sure they fit? Because we do have a couple of options.
Okay.
One of the things we like to do with performers when they come in is to have options of sizes, usually a size smaller and a size larger that's on their sheet.
Okay.
And the same with shirts and also with vests as well. That way we can get as many costumes on you as possible in a short amount of time, because everybody's time is
generally, what should I be
precious.
looking for in regards to the fit? Because right now they feel good.
No, if they feel good, if you were able to walk around and do any movement that you do, and they feel good, and that should be fine. We'll get them into rehearsal, so that way you know that they'll be really comfortable by the time you actually get to perform. So I'm just going to tie the bow for your cravat. So while I'm doing that, can you tell me a little bit about you? The character you're portraying, who is?
The Duke Orsino. He's a nobleman, a gentleman, a bachelor. He's in love with the character Olivia. And he has these large gestures of his feelings and his emotion and all of his unrequited love for her. And that's throughout the entire play. So, yeah, he's big, he's large, and he's in love. And he explains his love with music quite a bit. So he didn't take himself too seriously.
All right, cool. So we're going to try a vest on now. And as I said before, there are various options because you're in different scenes. So if you'd like to hold both of your cuffs and then put your arms straight back.
There we go.
The clothing in this era was particularly tight. So we will get rehearsal vests and things in for you. So Cam, you said that your character needs a walking stick. I've brought a selection here.
Okay.
Is it a scene that takes place in the country, or is it a scene that takes place in the city?
In the city.
Right, so why don't you try one of those? Let's try the tallest one first, and then we can see whether it suits you.
Okay.
So I'm going to try the other one.
Yes, sir.
Now make sure that you use it not as if it's a prop because you need it.
Okay.
It's all part of your personality.
Understood.
That's it, great. So I like both of them. It really does depend on which one is the most comfortable to you.
I think this one. This feels good.
Great. All right then. So let's look in the mirror. And what I suggest is puff your chest out. That's it. If you raise the core of your body up, your chest will expand and it will automatically make you look more confident. And when you walk with the walking stick, put the walking stick in front of you. There you go. Great. There are a couple of accessories that most men of any sort of aristocracy would have had.
Okay.
One of them would have been a signet ring, and that would have been used if you were sealing letters, then you'd have pressed the ring in.
Okay.
And on your next fitting, we'll find one for you and
Perfect.
try that on.
Perfect.
The other one would have been called a fob, and it used to hang below the waistcoat to the pants.
Okay.
But the one we have today is the handkerchief, and that was also an important accessory at the time. It was expensive. Only nobility would have been able to afford them, or the middle class.
Right.
And you'd have used it not to blow your nose or to wipe sweat away. You'd have used it to gesture at people.
Right.
Usually if you were outside, it was often used when you actually had your jacket on and then an overcoat
Right.
and pairs of gloves.
Right. So I just want to make sure people see it.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
absolutely.
So gestures like this.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, fantastic.
Conversation, things like that. Love it.
Yeah, great.
So you can see that the collaborative nature of theatrical production extends to the actor-designer relationship as well, and costumes can dramatically impact an actor's work. As a director, I also work closely with set designers. For my 2019 production of Twelfth Night for the University of Oklahoma, I worked with set design student Nathan Hatfield. Directorially, I was drawn to the shipwreck at the beginning of the play and the vivid water imagery present in the language throughout the text of Twelfth Night. I also knew I wanted to create a playful, whimsical environment in which the actors could have fun and highlight the lighter, comic elements in the play. As we talked about these ideas through a series of design meetings, Nathan created a design that included a platform made to look like broken pieces of a ship on top of several tons of beach sand. The design also included actual pools of water that the actors could splash around in and make practical use of. This wet, sandy environment allowed the actors to experiment with a strong sense of playfulness, suitable for a comedy with dreamlike elements. As this design was taken from the page to the stage, many practical issues also had to be considered to realize the designer's vision, like making sure the structure could hold the weight of all that sand and water. Early preparations for a production are often conducted in a rehearsal hall, while the scenic elements are being built on stage. This process can take days or weeks. If actors are working in a rehearsal hall, the production stage manager might tape the floor to indicate where doors, steps, or platforms of different levels can be expected on stage. This helps the actors and director plan the blocking that will work once they transfer rehearsals to the stage. Once the set is ready for the actors, part of the tech process for any production involves exploration of the physical space that's been constructed. Actors must become familiar with the stage space to make sure they know how to navigate it safely and use it to best tell the story they're entrusted with sharing. As you can imagine, the water and sand on the set of Twelfth Night provided many opportunities for the actors, but it also required towels backstage and a thorough cleanup of the spilled water and displaced sand every night. A stage manager and backstage crew are routinely responsible for these kinds of important maintenance and safety protocols. I should mention that during rehearsals and performances for a modern production of a Shakespeare play, or any play, the contributions of a stage manager cannot be overstated. The stage manager is not only the person responsible for the physical space used in rehearsal and performance, but they're also the center of communication between all arms of the production team. They write rehearsal and performance reports every night to make sure everyone working on the production has all the practical information they need to collaborate with each other. They also open the theater and close it up at the end of rehearsals and performances, facilitate communication between actors and designers about events such as costume fittings, and make sure we stay on time and on task throughout the process. During performances, the stage manager also calls the light and sound cues used during the show and helps manage the technicians who run the backstage part of the production process. Successful stage management requires equal parts organizational and people skills, making stage management among the most challenging jobs in the theater. In Shakespeare's day, there were no stage managers with this exact title, but many of these tasks might have been accomplished by the actor managers who ran the theaters, produced the plays, and often also performed roles on stage. The bulk of the work for these theatrical jobs happens off stage, in the hands of often unsung heroes who make it possible for the production to happen. If it's done well, when an audience comes into the theater to watch the play, they'll have no idea how many people or how many hours it takes to actually get to the moment the curtain rises or the lights come up. After everything we've covered in this lesson, I hope that you now do. And speaking of the lights coming up on a performance, in our next and final lesson, this course will culminate with our actors, Brooke and Cam, performing some of the scenes and monologues they've been rehearsing throughout. To complete their performance, they will be wearing Elizabethan costumes designed by Lloyd Cracknell and constructed by artisans in the University of Oklahoma Helmrich School of Drama Costume Studio. Now that you have firsthand knowledge of all the choices that go into taking Shakespeare from the page to the stage, I hope the next time you attend a performance of his work, your experience will be enhanced, if not transformed.